everyone, and welcome back. I have a big secret to confess. I've never been to a Ren Faire. I know, it's weird. I do all this historical fashion and costumes and events, and I have somehow yet to make it, officially in any capacity, to a Renaissance fair. I've just never lived conveniently near one, I suppose. For those that don't know what a Ren Faire is, it is vaguely based on sort of medieval Tudor era, but it really includes absolutely everything when it comes to fantasy. The whole thing just sets up like a giant fair in the old fairy tales of yore, where you have lots of events and booths, and you can go buy trinkets, and you can eat a turkey leg, and jousting, and performances, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff happening. But the general point is, be creative, show up, have fun, and just do what you want to with your outfit. You don't have to wear an outfit, but the point is to be creative and interesting with it. And somehow, this has just never been something that I've done. I've always wanted to. So when Abby and our friend Maggie were talking about meeting up at a Renaissance fair in Southern Indiana, I knew it was the perfect opportunity because not only could I finally make it to one, but I could also go spend a week at Abby's helping with the house and just all of that stuff. So I jumped on that opportunity really fast, and it was also really helpful in the fact that just before that came up, I had realized, watching through Our Flag Means Death, again for research purposes, videos, right? That I really wanted to make a waistcoat. I really wanted to do an early 18th century men's style waistcoat, and this gave me an excuse to do that. If you watched my video all about the fashion of pirates, I was wearing it in that video, and I am in love with that thing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go into detail about how I made that waistcoat and then show you the day that we spent at the Renaissance Fair. So interestingly enough, when I quite rapidly decided I'm going to do this, I've only got a few more weeks, I'm going ahead and buying tickets, I'm gonna come out and we're gonna do this. I encouraged also apparently Morgan to join us, so Morgan Donner also flew into Indiana to descend upon Abby's house, and our friend Maggie and her husband Albert came up as well, and we all managed to squeeze into Abby's house. Somehow we found enough room and enough beds, and thankfully for me, I was the first one to arrive, so I got to have my pick of the bedrooms and my pick of the mattress, because the sponsor of this week's video, once again, is Birch Mattress. Between late working hours and Bailey's sunrise wake up, I don't have much time to get the sleep that I need. So it's all the more important that every bit counts. In order to wake up feeling rested and functional, I know I need the right mattress, which is why I've been so excited to work with Birch. They make mattresses and sleep products that are stylish, comfortable, and environmentally conscious. Not only do they offer the simplicity of having a premium mattress delivered to your door, but they understand the importance of materials. Their non-toxic mattresses are made in America and are crafted with organic and natural materials that have been sustainably sourced. The new Birch Luxe mattress even includes fair trade certified cotton and New Zealand wool. All of their mattresses are also Green Guard Gold certified, which means no harsh chemicals are used. I put time and effort into sourcing clothing and textiles that are high quality and ethically produced, so I should do the same for my mattress. The fact that Birch puts so much emphasis on producing and harvesting sustainably is really important to me. On top of that, one of my favorite parts is that by having wool in these mattresses, it makes them both allergen and mildew resistant. I'm allergic to pretty much everything, and I can really tell the difference when I wake up in the morning compared to my old synthetic mattress. No more itchy eyes. I upgraded to the Birch Luxe mattress a few months ago, which has added quilted cotton pillow top and targeted lumbar support, including over 1,000 individually wrapped steel coils. It relieves pressure points and reduces stress on your body as you sleep, meaning I don't wake up with a sore back or toss and turn all night. I've been sleeping on a Birch mattress for about 8 months now, and I can't begin to tell you how glad I was to see my old mattress go. You don't realize how poor your sleep has been until you experience what it can be. But now I've been sleeping so soundly and waking up actually feeling rested. And you don't have to worry about trying it out. With your Birch mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial along with a 25-year warranty. That means you'll get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. If you don't, they'll pick it up for you and you'll get a full refund. The mattress arrives at your door rolled up in a box with free shipping in the US, and it was so easy to set up. I love my Birch mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch. You can click the link below or go to birchliving.com/Nicole Rudolph to get $400 off your mattress plus 2 free pillows. Thanks again to Birch Mattress for sponsoring this week's video and making sure that I had a comfortable week's sleep away from home. Because, oh, it was a busy week and it was a busy time building up to it. I had a lot of sewing to do before I was able to head out the door. The thing is, it's really important what you're wearing to a Ren Faire. Even if you're not going in costume, you have to make sure that you are comfortable, that you're going to be dealing with the weather appropriately, the heat, the sun, the rain, whatever's going to be that day. Usually it's out in a grassy area, and you have to make sure that you have shoes that are not only going to be comfortable for a lot of walking and standing, but also walking on uneven ground. You have to make sure that you have pouches and things that you need to store all your stuff. If you're in costume, then they have to kind of blend with it. You don't want like a modern backpack or something if you don't have to. So I knew, even though I'd never been to one, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it and planning it and watching videos about it, so I was prepared for the fact that I probably wasn't going to have what I needed. Though I do have a fair amount of historical stuff that could work. I have some things that are appropriate for summer weather. I could cobble together something kind of cottagecore. I've done that before, but it wasn't quite the vibe that I was going for. I was really into that pirate aesthetic at the time, still am. So I decided to make a few new things. The waistcoat was the key part of this. I knew that I needed something to go under the waistcoat, a shirt. 18th century pirate shirt sort of thing made the most sense. I do have a couple of 18th century white linen shirts, but again, not quite what I was going for. I think I wanted black linen. I had just enough black linen in my storage to make up not just a shirt, but a long enough one to be considered a dress appropriately. And part of that was knowing that I was going to be able to wear that for modern purposes. Put a belt on it, really cute dress. I also thought I was going to be able to wear it as a dress with the waistcoat over it. That didn't really work out, as you'll see. It just didn't quite look right. I had to add trousers in at the last second, but that's okay. I'm not going to talk about making that shirt dress in this video. I actually did 2 videos on my Patreon, which the first goes into detail about exactly how I patterned out everything, came up with the measurements. The second video goes into the detail of how I machine stitched my shirt together, because yes, that's right, I machine stitched all of this. I'll get to that more in a second, because it's a departure from what I normally do. I understand that, but there are reasons. So if you want to see more on those videos, head over to Patreon and check out the tier that has videos. I also have started YouTube memberships. This is going to be different than what's on my Patreon. This is only for those extra videos. It doesn't have any of the extra benefits that come on Patreon with extra posts or early access to videos or monthly lives or the Discord or any of that stuff. I wanted to make some of the videos that I'm doing on instructionals a little bit more accessible to lots of different people, and so without changing the value of anything, that allows me to offer just that for a little bit less. So if that is something you're interested in, I am trying to build up that library of videos at this point, hopefully getting a lot more out in the near future, but the entire process of the shirt stuff is already over there. In terms of other things that I made, it was just the leather pouch, which I did a short on because literally that took me about 2 hours to make. It's really simple, just whatever shape you want for the actual pouch shape, and the flap, and then a couple straps and a half circle in order to come up with a little gathered part in front. Super simple construction, and I made it so it can go over a belt or be attached to a clip, because this is where I was really smart about things and really proud of myself. I managed just barely with enough time to realize that I didn't have a good system for carrying a full-size camera with me, which is pretty heavy, and a bag full of things like water bottle and all of my extras I needed for the day. So I knew I needed something to carry the weight, because I have a lot of back problems and shoulder issues, and putting a purse pouch thing over my shoulder usually is really painful for me. And I didn't want all of the weight to be on my waist all of the time. But I ended up coming across this camera harness, which not only did very well for the day because I can hang the weight off of my shoulders evenly, or they have little clips that actually allow you to hook it onto a belt as well, so I could go back and forth depending on what I needed. And it aesthetically fits in really well with the outfit, and quite frankly, I'm going to wear this thing on so many trips in the near future. I'm so excited about this. So I have that modern belt, and then the final thing that I knew that I needed was a good pair of shoes. Thankfully, last year I had purchased a pair of knee-high lace-up boots from Joe Bear, and I had not had a reason to wear them yet. Again, everything for this event just worked out perfectly. I already had so much of what I needed, and what I didn't have was stuff that honestly I didn't realize how much I needed it in my just overall life. So all of that came together. But again, the most important thing, and the thing we're going to cover in detail today, is that waistcoat. So I've already talked at length in a previous video about the styles that were in the early 18th century, in the golden age of pirates, and so that's the waistcoat style that I'm going with. I did, however, realize that what was important to me for this project was not the typical thing. Usually I want to do things historically accurately. I want to show you guys how things are hand-stitched, put together, the right layers, all the bits and pieces that add up to something being as historically accurate as possible, because we're trying to understand the history of the garment and what it looked like and how it moved versus just a stationary museum exhibit. That's not the point of this. The point was I needed something that was quick and easy, gave the right effect, and could be worn on a hot spring, what really felt more like summer, day, be washable, be something that I might actually even wear in the rest of my modern life. And I had actually just been eyeing a fabric from Mood that is a cut velvet. The only downside to this cut velvet is that it's stretch, which isn't a huge deal in the fact that it's not super stretchy. I ended up, because of the way that I constructed it, doesn't really have any stretch. The reason why I generally avoid stretch outside of fit issues is the fact that it's really hard to hand stitch through. It's not friendly in that way. But like I said before, I'm machine stitching all of this. Speed was more important to me, and quite frankly, I have done a lot of machine stitching of 18th century clothing before. That's actually where I started my journey into historical clothing, was doing that as my job. So I have developed since then my own method of very rapidly machine stitching a waistcoat to be as non-obtrusively machine stitched as possible, which meant that I was able to put this together in just a couple of days. Thank goodness, because I had a lot of other stuff going on at the same time. But I ended up with a waistcoat that honestly I've incorporated into my modern clothing more than a couple of times already. I didn't realize just how much I loved this style. The pattern for this early 18th century waistcoat comes generally from Nora Waugh's The Cut of Men's Clothes. I ended up having to make a fair amount of alterations to the garment just because I am a different size, and most importantly, I am a different height when it comes to the torso length. So a fair amount of change later, I ended up with a final pattern and got to cutting out. Despite the fact that the outer fabric I'm using is a modern stretch fabric, I'm going to treat this as if it is not, meaning that the lining is going to be out of a not stretchy material. In this case, I'm using a cotton because it's what I had a lot of, but linen would be more historically accurate. I am still using a linen for the internal canvas just because beetle linen or different types of linen buckram, it gives you the right weight and feel, even if you're machine stitching it. To one side of this interfacing, I am adding a folded over strip called a button stand, which just simply means that when I put the weight of the buttons on that side of the waistcoat, it won't get all droopy and start to sag. So that little extra folded piece makes a big difference. The canvas can then be laid down onto the front and basted into place. Again, still a necessary thing even with machine stitching. I am going to machine stitch down that internal line running from the top to bottom. That's because it's not really visible on my fabric. This is something that you may want to hand stitch with a prick stitch though, if your fabric shows the stitching really clearly. With that in place, we can move on to the pocket. The way the 18th century pockets are done is that the pocket flap sits above the pocket opening. It's not like a welt pocket where it all goes together at one step. You can choose whatever shape you think is appropriate for your pocket opening. I went with kind of smiley face, but it can be more of a triangle. It can be a little more narrow or a little more wide. And you definitely want to put a reinforcement behind this. If you're going to put any weight in those pockets, they're going to start drooping, and having reinforcement of a canvas, be linen, something like that behind it makes a big difference. So I'm going to be going through all 3 layers for my first section of stitching. Basting it all together really helps with this. We'll just be stitching all the way around the pocket opening. I like to cut down the center even if I'm going to trim it up just a little bit, and since we've come to a point on the ends, we just need to clip to that corner. There's no Y shape or anything like that since it's not a square end. Remove the basting and flip the pocketing to the interior. At this point you can press it and make sure that it sits nice and cleanly. do a clipping if you need to. I didn't end up doing any clipping because I only had about a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the most in any location, so I didn't have an issue with that. And then we are ready for the pocket flaps. These are also layered up with some linen canvas, so that way they have a bit more strength to them, especially if you're going to be putting functional buttonholes into them. I am choosing, because of the lightweight bead of linen, that I'm just letting it go into the seam allowance. If you have a really heavy linen canvas or a really heavy fabric and you're trying to reduce bulk, you might do better to either trim back really far after you've done this, or better yet, just hand stitch this in. I know it's a little bit more tedious, but it's the reason why I went with beaded linen, so that way I could simply machine stitch around all the edges, clip them back, and fold everything into place. Then it's time to get started on the buttonholes. For the buttonholes, I ended up machine stitching them because there are so many 5 per pocket alone and so many down the front. I machine zigzagged over a heavier cord in order to get a fuller looking, more pronounced buttonhole. It looks a little bit more historical. It's definitely not going to look hand stitched, but that's okay. I just can't use the buttonhole setting because it doesn't go as long as most of the buttonholes of this era need to be. At that point, I'm ready to start attaching the pocket flap just above the pocket opening. I do pull down the pocketing on the top, so that way I'm only going through the pocket flap, the exterior fabric, and that linen structure layer. This is going to make it easier to finish the pocket later, but I machine stitch all those layers and fold the pocket flap down. I don't like the way this looks with bulkier fabrics. You end up with this chunky bit at the ends. So one of the historical methods you can use is to cut right at where that seam allowance ends, clip up towards the stitched end of your pocket flap, and you will essentially open up and press that like a seam. So the pocket flap seam allowance gets folded down and the body seam allowance gets folded up, and it ends up being pretty even. You then have to reattach things together, zigzagging the pocket flap seam allowance to the body. The body seam allowance is still pushed up out of the way. And once you've zigzagged that back, we'll cover that up later, it's then time to stitch the pocket bag together, which is why we left it free earlier. And now we can finish off the pocket flap. You can machine stitch a little L at both ends in order to reinforce the flap so it doesn't end up pulling or ripping. I like to do this by hand just because it's kind of chunky and it's honestly a little hard to get it even with the machine, in my opinion. After the ends are secured with a back stitch, I then go along with a slip stitch going just through the lining layer of the pocket flap and slipping it down to the body of the coat. This covers up the weird zigzag seam that I did earlier, so you won't see that machine stitching. The ends of the pocket opening are then finished either with a buttonhole stitch by hand or a zigzag stitch by machine. If it's kind of hard to get in there, just do it by hand, and that will prevent it from pulling or ripping, especially if you put a lot of weight in there. With all of the work done on the exterior of the front, it's time to add the lining. I'm simply going to lay this down on the lining fabric. I'm pin and stitch around all the edges with the exception of the shoulder seam and the side seam, so only as far up on the sides as these skirts go where they're separated. Once you reach the point where I need to attach to the back, I'm going to leave those loose. Everything else gets stitched around all of the edges, clipped and trimmed back as need be in order to get things to turn smoothly, and then we'll end up turning the whole thing right side out, pressing it and making sure that it is flat and even, all the corners are well turned, and then I have entire fronts and I'm ready to start doing buttons and buttonholes. There are so many on this era of waistcoats. I ended up with over 20 down the front. So each one of those I mark with a pin first to make sure I have the proportions that I want, and then I go in and mark out with chalk exactly where the buttonholes need to be. Same thing as before, just using a zigzag instead of a buttonhole attachment, and going over a cord in order to get the pronunciation and shape of the buttonholes that I want. I do recommend you make sure that you leave enough space between the zigzags that you can still cut open the buttonholes. I definitely did not do a good job of that, however, most of those I will never need to open because I won't be buttoning this the whole way up and down, so it turned out okay in the end. That is definitely something to be aware of. Once the fronts are ready to go, it's time to move on to the backs. Center back seam gets stitched up for both the lining and the exterior, making sure to not go down past where it opens for a vent in the center back. And the next thing to do is starts to get a little confusing. The fronts, I highly recommend attaching both fronts to the exterior at just the side seams and the shoulder seams. I'm doing just one side seam. Don't worry about that, just I recommend doing it the other way. You'll also notice at this point that my backs are actually out of the fabric rather than out of a cheaper lining material, but that's what I wanted visually. It'll help you understand what's lining and what's not. Once you have the backs fully attached to your exterior fabric, then you can lay the lining and the exterior back together. Essentially, these fronts are going to get sandwiched in between all the layers. We're making a weird little pillow. And we're going to be machine stitching around all of the edges. So going down and around the skirts and the vents, up to the side seams, around the neck, shoulders, arm sides, everything except about 6 inches on one side seam. Everything else gets fully stitched around. And that's because we're going to need to be able to turn this right side out somehow. So that side seam allows you to do that. That's also why even if you don't want to stitch your fronts onto the back fully, like I shortcutted, you need to do it for at least one side, because you don't want that side unstitched when you get around the whole body. So having that one opening in the side seam allows you to turn the whole thing right side out. You don't have to worry about it being sleeveless, it's just so much faster. And it's time for buttons. If we have over 30 buttonholes, we need over 30 buttons. And I decided to cover all of mine. I didn't really have another style that I thought would be appropriate, so I chose a portion of the design of the velvet that I thought looked good, cut the circles a little bit bigger than the mold itself, not so much that they would overlap in the middle, gathering stitch around the edges. I like to overlap by 1 or 2 stitches, just so it's less likely that the knot that I put in is going to pull out. Gather that down, and then the way that I tend to attach this to the back is sort of rotating as I go, just stitching across over and over and over again, so you end up with a starburst in the middle. It's not visible in this case, but that is my preferred method for covering buttons. It gives you something nice to anchor into when you are stitching the buttons down to the garment. So you have all those threads meeting up in the middle, they're pretty sturdy, and you can catch those in the fabric in order to make sure to secure. I did wrap the thread around a couple of times to give a little bit of loft since it's a pretty thick garment. I don't want the button to not fit through the buttonhole well. The very last thing is to stitch up that little 6-inch side seam section that you left open at the lining, and we're ready to go.
Guys, her ear is right there. It's right here. I found it. It's right here. It's right here. Hey, Morgan, do you want to know where your ear is? It's right there.
I feel something.